Welcome to a special edition of the Darden Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, I'm excited to share a recent installment from our ongoing Faculty Spotlight series, a series we call Office Hours, featuring Professor Justin Hopkins. Justin is a member of the accounting faculty here at the Darden School of Business, and I recently connected with him to talk more about his background, what led him to Darden, what got him interested in accounting, some of the courses he teaches here at Darden, as well as his research interests. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. And as always, if this conversation is helpful for you, please like this episode and subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an update. And remember, you can always check the episode description for links to Darden blogs, social channels, and more. And now, without further ado, here's my Office Hours conversation with Professor Justin Hopkins. Welcome, everyone. My name is Brett Twitty. I'm a member of the admissions committee here at the Darden School. Thank you so much for joining us for this Office Hour session. If you've been on with us before, Office Hours is our faculty spotlight series. You know, we've had 20 plus conversations with members of the Darden faculty, and so excited to have a member of our accounting faculty join us today, Justin Hopkins. I've got to know Justin through his work with our ExecMBA students, but he's taught across all the formats here at Darden, and so a great person to talk to about the learning experience at Darden. You might have some questions about accounting. We're going to get into his research as well. So Justin, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. Wonderful to be a part of this group. Always love to share my experience and talk about Darden. So thanks for inviting me.
So Justin, we always start with the same first question. Tell us a little bit more about you. Who are you? What's your background?
Awesome. Thanks, Brett. So my name is Justin Hopkins. I am a full-time faculty here at the Darden Graduate School of Business. It's funny because Brett and I were just talking about this before we started the session, but we both went to UNC Chapel Hill. So I got my PhD from UNC in 2012, and then I interviewed with a bunch of different schools, and Darden felt like the best fit for me for what I wanted to achieve in my career, the fit, and we'll talk about this as this talk progresses. But I started in 2013, so I've been here ever since. So this is my 13th year here teaching, and like you mentioned, I've taught in the full-time program, I've taught in the executive program, as well as the part-time program. So I've experienced all three formats. I've taught a variety of different courses. Let's see what else. Before I went to UNC, I lived in Ohio, and I worked for what we call a Big Four accounting firm, Ernst & Young, which is known as EY. And then before Ohio, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Dominican Republic. So I spent 3 years there, and that's where I met my wife, who was from Ohio, which led us there. Before that, I was an undergraduate student at Montana State University, and I'll lead into our next question, Brett, which is how did I get into accounting, and how did I find myself as an accounting instructor? So I had an undergrad. I feel like I'm very blessed because at 19 years old, I knew what I wanted to do with my life. And I think that's pretty rare. And I think especially more so given the variety of different careers that people can have over the course of their life. But I had a really unique experience that really touched me. And I had an instructor in particular. Her name was Christy Johnson. And fantastic individual, just somebody who really gave back and really spoke into the students. And she developed relationships with everybody, got to know everyone, what our career goals and aspirations were, and she really kind of worked alongside of us. And at the end, before we graduated, she helped us to write our resumes. And we would go back and forth, right? I would write the resume. She would mark it up and say, you could be a little bit clear about this. Why don't you clarify that? Give it back. We would rewrite it, give it back to her. And then this went back and forth a couple of times. And then she looked through it. I still remember this like it was yesterday, but this was back in, this is a while ago, like 1997. And I remember her looking at that. And then she goes, yep. And then she opens this drawer and she slides the piece of paper in. And I was like, that's odd. She just kept my resume. And so I asked her about it and I said, what are you doing? What do you do with those resumes? And she said, whenever I'm having a bad day or I'm feeling down, what I do is I open this drawer and I pull out a resume and I think about that student and I think about how I've touched them. And as a 19-year-old, that really meant a lot to me. And I thought, holy cow, this is like a pretty interesting career that you could actually affect future generations. You could really speak into people's lives. And so that's when I first considered education as a career. And but I did know that in order to be a good educator, I felt like I wanted to have a variety of different experiences. And so, like I mentioned, the time I spent in the Philippines with the Asian Development Bank, what I did after I graduated is I tried to get a variety of different experiences. I've worked for the government. I've worked as an auditor, as I mentioned, with Ernst and Young. So I audited publicly traded companies. I audited small private companies. After that, I've also worked with the Justice Department. So I was a consultant to the Justice Department. I was basically an internal auditor. So I would go around to different U.S. attorneys' offices throughout the country and I'd audit them, make sure they were spending the resources that they were allotted to efficiently and in accordance with the law. And then I thought, you know what? I've been doing this for a decade now. I've got 10 years of experience in the private public sector. Went to UNC and got my PhD, and then came here. So I think that was and when people come to me and say, "Hey, I want to become a professor. I want to get a PhD." That's the advice I tell them is go get a job first. Go do the work first, the work that your students are ultimately going to do, because you can't really teach them if you don't know what they're going to end up doing. And maybe you'll like it. Maybe you won't want to go and get a PhD, right? But if you do, you'll be a much better instructor. You'll be a much better professor and a much better researcher because you'll have the understanding of what these careers actually mean. And so that was my journey from 1995 till today. So recap in a nutshell.
What is it about accounting that captured your interest?
That's funny you mentioned that. So it's very pragmatic. And when I went to school, I was like, what are the best things that this university teaches? Like I want to learn from the best instructors at this school. So I knew what school I had to go to for a variety of different reasons. And they said, well, we do really good training engineers, and all of our accounting students pass the CPA exam and they go to Silicon Valley. They go to work for major corporations and they have great careers. And I knew a few engineers, and they didn't have jobs that they enjoyed. And so I was like, accounting sounds like a better track. But I never thought I would be an accountant. I thought, this is a good skill to have. It's like learning a language. Doesn't mean you're going to have to be a translator, but it's going to make you a better, more informed person no matter what you do. And so I kind of anticipated that just being a stepping stone to a different career. Maybe I'd go and get an MBA, maybe I'd go into banking, something else. But it turns out that I found accounting to be fascinating, super interesting. And I just kept going. I never stopped studying it. And so I got a bachelor's in accounting, I got a master's, and then I got a PhD. So yeah, I've been studying accounting ever since.
What do you find fascinating about?
It's, I'm a little hesitant to say this because most people, their experience with accounting, maybe they've taken a course in undergrad and they're learning debits and credits. But I think with most disciplines, the surveys, the intros don't really tell you what it's about. Once you start grappling with the measurement issues, how do we calculate these things? What does it really mean to make a profit? These are really tough questions to ask yourself. And I, in particular, like learning about the incentive structure around financial reporting and measurement. So if you measure something, right, this way, that's going to not just affect how you calculate something, but that's going to filter through the whole organization, and it's going to become part of the incentive structure of everyone who's there. And so people will start changing their behavior and how they interact with others and how they continue their jobs because something is measured this way as opposed to that way. And so it has some real effects on how organizations operate. It has real effects on how decisions are made, and it has real effects on how resources are allocated across the economy. And once you sort of recognize that, you see the power in just information. It's something that really becomes important.
You mentioned you did a Peace Corps stint in Dominican Republic. What led you to join the Peace Corps?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I grew up in a small town in northern Montana, close to the Canadian border. Um, you know, uh, in that area of the world, you don't travel a lot. Like, get outside your county was kind of unusual. Um, my dad and my mom did take us to a big city. Like, we'd go to Seattle, we'd go to Minneapolis. But that's like a 12-hour drive. So I did have some exposure, but I'd never traveled really beyond that. And I also felt like I wanted to give back. I wanted to serve my country in a way that I felt was appropriate for myself. And I felt like I had a really blessed upbringing. I had two parents who loved me. They provided for me. And I knew that a lot of people around the world didn't have that as an opportunity. And I felt like just growing up in the United States provides you with so many different opportunities that people in other countries didn't have. And so I just wanted to give back. And as a business student and somebody who studied Spanish, the Dominican Republic was one of the countries that they had a big business program. And I had a little bit of language studies. So that's where I was assigned. So I was assigned as a volunteer to a project. Well, the way it works in the Peace Corps is they assign you to a non-governmental organization, or this is how it worked in the Dominican Republic. And so I worked for, it was called the White Fly Project, the Mosca Blanca. And what they did is it was a project that worked with farmers. And they provided farmers with technical assistance on agriculture. So what crops to plant at what times, what fertilizers to use, so on and so forth. But there was also this financial component along with it. So they gave farmers funding in order to buy the seeds to be able to plant. The farmers would plant. When they would harvest the crops, they would pay back the loans. So what they said to me was, they called me Javier. So, I got to change my name because I had a host family. So here's the story. I had a host family and she's like, "What's your name?" And I was like, "Justin." And she's like, "Justine?" And I was like, "Justino." And she's like, "Justino es un nombre muy feo." She's like, "This is a really ugly name." So I was like, "Well, how about Javier?" And she's like, "Oh, that's much better." So I went by Javier in the 3 years that I was there. And so when I joined the Mosca Blanca, they said, "Javier, like, here's the problem. We give the farmers money to plant. They plant, they harvest the crops, and they pay us back." And they're like, "What we'd like them to be able to do is to be able to budget, plan for their expenses, and to be able to manage their finances so that they were not dependent on us for financing every single time they need to plan." And so what I did is I just made a rudimentary accounting system. And I said, let's go through one business cycle and let's account for how much money you're going to make in the farm. So every time you spend money, write it down on this list, right? And then we'll come back, we'll see how much money you made. And then maybe out of that money, we'll think about how we can figure out how to save a little bit of that so that after a few cycles, you'll have enough money to be able to plant on your own. And so it was a way to integrate financial management with the technical side of actually farming. So that's what I did.
That's very cool. I've not heard you tell that story before, so thank you for indulging the Peace Corps story. You mentioned that
And
you
then,
felt like Dart. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so I'll mention this too. So we just started quarter 4 this week. So I just taught class on Monday and Tuesday, quarter 4, for our first year full-time students. And then whenever I teach this course, I always introduce myself, and I tell them just I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Dominican Republic. Right. This year, for the very first time in 13 years, I had a student who was also a Peace Corps volunteer from the Dominican Republic. So there you go. And a wonderful connection to make. I've had over the 13 years one student from the Dominican Republic too. So there you go. There's the connections we're able to make here at Darden.
Yeah, thank you. I was curious, you mentioned that Darden felt like the right place for you. Why did it feel like the right place for you as a faculty member?
That's a good question. So as a faculty member, uh, your main responsibilities are to write, conduct research, write papers, and to teach. And when you get a PhD, it tells you most top PhD programs focus on the writing aspect. So, for example, the curriculum include people ask me, like, how do you study? Is this like three-dimensional debits and credits getting a PhD? People have no context. So getting a PhD in accounting is basically applied economics. And so the courses that I took were very in line with somebody who's getting a microeconomics PhD. So you take a lot of economic theory. You take what we call econometrics, which is the use of statistics to test economic questions. You learn how to program. You learn data sets. So it's a lot about analyzing data, asking questions about that are useful for accounting. So the profession of accounting is really about the production, dissemination, and analysis of information. And so we ask questions related to that. And then we bring data to test those questions. And so that's what a PhD is really all about. And so it's basically training people to conduct research. But as I told you from the very beginning, my motivation for becoming an educator was really more about the teaching side, right? And so when you look at top level business programs, the emphasis is far more on the research side than the teachings. And, don't get me wrong, and we'll get into this as you mentioned, some of the research that I'm doing. Love doing research. It's fantastic. It's a great way to spend your time. But I also really was engaged in the teaching aspect. And I interviewed at a variety of different schools. I think I had like 8 different job interviews. And of those 8 different job interviews, 7 of them were about exactly the same. They basically said, you're going to lecture to undergraduate students. And what that's going to allow you to do is to just focus on spending your time doing research. So we'll give you a TA to grade your courses, to grade all your exams. They're going to be the ones that are holding office hours. So you don't even have to really interact with students at all. That way, all of your time will be allocated to conducting research. And as a junior faculty, that's sort of ideal because what you want to do is you want to be publishing papers. That's how you get your name known in the profession. But I was kind of like, I don't really want to lecture. I don't want to just stand in front of people that I'll never see again and just talk about debits and credits. I kind of want to get to know people. And so when you come and you interview at Darden, you actually sit in a course and you interact with MBA students, and they say, this is really part of the DNA. Because Darden is part of the University of Virginia. University of Virginia was founded by one of our founding fathers named Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had this vision of what a university should be, an academical village. And if you come to the University of Virginia, you'll see the buildings that he designed and the campus that he actually designed. And the way it works is that the buildings have 2 floors. On top is where the faculty were designed to live, and on bottom is where they gave their classes. So the design that Jefferson had was this close interaction between faculty and students. Students lived with the faculty members. And that sort of culture kind of pervades through today, where we have all kinds of different traditions at Darden where faculty and students interact. And I saw that. And I thought, wow, this is really kind of what I want to do. I do want to research, but I also want to get to know people. I want to speak to their lives. I want to get to know them. somehow find a way to help them in their career aspirations. And so it was the only school that felt like this to me, Brett. And so it was really easy. When I interviewed here, I told my wife, I was like, this is where we're going to go. If I get this offer, I don't care what the other schools say. I'm going to come here. And, thankfully they gave me the offer. And so here I've been ever since.
Well, I want to talk about your classes. So you mentioned you've taught core accounting. We have managerial accounting and financial accounting in the core, as well as an elective. Let's talk about the core first. How do you see accounting fitting into the broader core curriculum? There's 10 subject areas in the core, so lots of different kinds of classes. How does accounting fit in?
Yeah, good question, Brett. So there are you come to Darden, you'll take 2 quarters of accounting. The first quarter is what we would call managerial accounting. The second quarter would be financial. And so you're going to be taking courses such as operations, finance, communications, so on and so forth, a variety of different disciplines. Accounting is really a core, you're asking an accountant, an accounting professor about the importance of our own subject matter. And so, of course, we're going to say, look, this is really fundamental. This is learning the language of business. And for example, in a strategy course, you might talk about a product differentiation strategy or a strategy where you have high margins and low volume. In your finance course, you might talk about weighted average cost of capital or discounted cash flow models. But what I tell students is no matter what course you're going to take, you're probably going to be using financial information. You're going to be using margins. You're going to be using return on assets, right? All of these come from financial statements that are made by accountants. And so if you don't know how to read those financial statements, if you don't know what these terms mean, how can you possibly analyze this information? And so that's what the accounting curriculum is designed to do, is to help give students a richer context. When you're pulling these numbers off the balance sheet and income statement, what are these numbers actually representing? Are these the right numbers to be using to answer this particular question that you're trying to answer? And so it really fits in well with a variety of different courses that you're going to be taking your first year.
So you mentioned there's managerial and financial accounting. What's managerial accounting all about?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, because I did sort of gloss over that. And so, like I said, the practice of accounting is really about the production, dissemination, and analysis of information. Okay. So if we think about information today, I don't think anybody would argue that information's not important, right? Information doesn't matter. But the usage of information does vary. So managerial accounting is about the usage of information to run the organization better. So how do we use information internally to make better decisions about production or product differentiation strategies or whatnot? When you're making decisions, you're typically going to have spreadsheets, you're going to have graphs, charts, and you're going to say, hey, based on the information that we have, this is what we think that we should do. So managerial accounting is about capturing that information to help decision makers to run the organization better. Financial information is about the public disclosure of information. So for example, if somebody said, hey, Google made, $20 billion this quarter, they're using financial information. And so it's information from the balance sheet, the income statement, the statement of cash flow, publicly disclosed information. So this is typically used by analysts and people who are, on Wall Street making decisions about how do we allocate resources across different corporations or different companies. And so how does information get publicly disclosed? And as an external observer of Google, how does this information tell us about Google and what it's going to do going forward?
Thank you for explaining that. That's something that we oftentimes will get asked by prospective students as admissions folks. Like, can you help me understand these two different accounting courses in the core? We have a lot of students who come without background in accounting. What do you tell students that they can do prior to the start of school that could be helpful to them just to get comfortable with some of these concepts and terminology?
Very good question. I'm glad you brought that up, Brett. First thing I'd say is don't worry. It'll be okay. So when you teach a course like accounting, where sometimes we do have right answers, right? Calculate our cost of goods sold under the LIFO system for quarter one of 2026. There will be a right answer to that question. And in our classes, we'll have 65 students in the full-time program, roughly that, in the part-time and executive programs. Well, so 60 to 70 students, right? Of those 60 to 70 students, a few of them will have a background in accounting or finance. It'll vary depending on the program, but in the residential full-time program, maybe there will be 10 or 15 students that'll have a background. There'll be maybe one who's a CPA, one who's a CFA. So there'll be maybe one expert, one person who really understands this material, 10, 15 who have taken several courses, who've worked in the area, right? We will have probably about that number who've got absolutely no background whatsoever. So we'll have engineers, we will have people from the military, we will have fourth grade teachers, right? And then in the middle, we'll have people who've taken maybe one or two courses, right? So we've got a whole variety of students. And I kind of love that. I love the variation in understanding and expertise, because what you'll do is you will lean on those people who have that background and experience to explain it to everybody else, right? This is how I think about it. This is how I understand. And furthermore, the people on the bottom end, I find, ask the best questions because they're coming from a blank slate. They've never seen this before. And so what I would say to them is like, look, don't worry about it. Don't worry about sort of getting boned up. We do have, as you probably will talk about, Brett, we do have modules. We do have online opportunities for people. And so we do recommend that people take those and get trained up. But just to have some exposure to it. But I would also say, as an instructor, I'm going to assume that there are people who have absolutely no background in this. And I'm going to gear the class discussion accordingly, right? And so what I like to do as an instructor is I like to have time during each class where I'm speaking specifically to each of those three different groups. And so I'll have time where I'm saying, hey, look, this is geared toward the people who don't have any background. This is geared toward people who have a little bit. And then at the end, I like to bring in some extra stuff for the people who are experts to challenge them, to get them to think about it a little bit differently as well. So depending on where you are on that spectrum, I'm going to come to class prepared for your understanding, to give you and to challenge you in some way if you're an expert, or to help you to think about this and to frame this material in a way that's understandable and relatable to you if you don't.
Thank you for walking us through that. One of the most common questions we get from prospective students is, so I hear, Darden, does the case method, even in accounting? Like, is it like, how do you teach accounting through the case method?
Yeah, that's so I get this from my colleagues as well. As a researcher, one thing we do is we go to conferences. We write our papers, we go present them in front of our colleagues, and we interact with each other. And so I get this question all the time from my colleagues who are teaching at other universities. And some of them will ask me, like, do you think I should teach in the case method? And usually I'll say no. And the reason is because the case method is very inefficient. If you just want to learn accounting standards, I don't think the case method is going to get you there. And by far and away, most of my colleagues are teaching undergraduate accounting students. So these are students who are aspiring CPAs. So these are students who really need to know and understand US GAAP and accounting rules backwards and forwards. Yeah. MBA students are not like that. Okay. MBA students don't need to know all of these particulars and details about accounting. What they need to know is, hey, look, Brett, give me the big picture takeaway here. How does this information help me to understand whether this company is a good leveraged buyout prospect? Okay. So they kind of want the big picture takeaway. They want to understand more the context of the numbers, and they want to understand, hey, what does this information tell me about the future of this company? Okay. And so in that context, if that's what you're using accounting information for, I think the case method really is superior, because then it becomes more of a managerial discussion and decision-making process. And that's where the case method really excels, is not, hey, what's the right number? But what does this number tell us about the company? Right. And that's where it becomes a discussion.
I'm curious about your financial reporting elective. You mentioned this is a course that you teach in Q4. I think the course that you referred to earlier, right? It's the one you're teaching right now. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So the way it works at Darden is your first quarters are going to be core. And so you're just going to go in lockstep, right? And then toward the end of your first year, it's going to open up to electives. You're going to be able to choose which courses you want to take in that final quarter. And one of the electives that you'll have an opportunity to take is called financial reporting. And that's the one that I'm teaching right now. And so it's a more advanced accounting course. It's typically geared towards students who are going into banking and financial careers, but it also appeals to students who are going into consulting as well, and a variety of different. I try to make it as broad. The first year electives, we try to make as broad as possible. And so what I like to tell students is this is going to give you a greater context. So anybody who's going to be using accounting information in the future, I'm gearing it towards them.
Is there a case you enjoy teaching in this class, or something you would want to highlight to kind of animate the experience a little bit for our attendees today?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll tell you about the two cases that I taught this week, Monday and Tuesday. So Monday and Tuesday, what I try to do for the first week of my elective is this is what I call the framework of financial reporting. And what I say is what you should have seen in your first two quarters of your accounting core is that managers have a lot of discretion and decisions to make when they're making accounting decisions and producing this financial information. And so what people typically don't realize is when Google says we made $20 billion this quarter, underlying that $20 billion number are all kinds of estimates and managerial decisions. Okay. There's a lot of gray area there. And so what I tell students is the first week, we're going to talk about the context of financial reporting. We're going to talk about the incentives that managers face when they make these discretionary decisions. Okay. And so the first day, we look at a case that I wrote about WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment. And it's an organization that has a very unique corporate structure in which they have two classes of shares. And so managers typically, at the time of the case, the CEO was a man named Vince McMahon. And Vince owned a class of shares. For each share, it gave him 10 votes. Okay. Now, this is at the time of the case writing, this is a publicly traded company. So you go and you could buy a share of WWE, but that would only give you one vote for each share you bought. And so what we talk about is if somebody bought every single share of stock outstanding, they still would not have the votes that Vince does because he has the supermajority voting shares. And so we talk about the rights of investors in an organization where the CEO has supermajority voting power over the organization. And this is actually a very common structure in corporate America. A lot of tech firms have this. Famous cases like Meta. Mark Zuckerberg also has supermajority voting shares. So if you went out and you bought every single share of Meta stock outstanding, right, you're only getting one vote. Mark Zuckerberg has 10 votes for each of his shares. So he's going to control that corporation regardless of who owns that. And so we talk about, in those contexts, what does financial reporting mean? When we're analyzing a company, how do we look at their financial records differently, right? The second class we do is a case where I look at Elon Musk's compensation package at Tesla. And this is important because this mimics a lot of different compensation packages across corporate America. Oftentimes, executives are compensated through stock. And so they're given very, very little cash, but they're given a ton of stock. And so when your executive has a bunch of stock or stock compensation, how does that change financial reporting? And what you'll see, Brett, is that the way that these compensation programs are structured, and we go through this in class, is that in order for Elon Musk or an executive to receive stock compensation, the company oftentimes has to hit certain performance thresholds. And believe it or not, those performance thresholds are based on accounting numbers. So, for example, Tesla had to reach an earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and what does the A stand for? Man, I'm killing myself. Amortization, EBITDA. It had to reach EBITDA thresholds of 1.5 billion, 3 billion, 4.5 billion, 6 billion in order for Elon Musk to receive compensation. So every time that Tesla reached these thresholds, it would trigger another grant to Elon Musk. And so then we talk about how, hey, look, here's a usage of financial reporting and accounting is not just to help people to analyze the company, but it's really determining whether the CEO is going to receive the next tranche of stock options. And so in an organization where accounting is used for this, what does that mean for Elon Musk and Tesla's managers when they're making discretionary decisions about how to calculate the number that's ultimately driving their compensation, right? And it's a fascinating case because you might know that a shareholder sued Tesla saying that this compensation package was unfair, and the judge ruled in favor of the shareholder, so took away Elon's pay package, which then caused them to reincorporate out of Delaware into Texas. And so maybe you've heard some of these issues in the paper or in conversations, but it was ultimately driven by this judge making a decision about Elon's compensation package. And so we talk about all of these issues in class, but it really centers around the compensation structure, which is designed around accounting numbers. And so that's how I tie in accounting to the case.
That's super interesting. We had an interesting conversation with Yo-Jed Chang as part of Office Hours. She's somebody who does a lot of work in sort of corporate governance area. Tesla has a very interesting corporate governance structure. The board of Elon Musk companies can be very friendly to him, I guess is one way to express that. Not your typical board structure that you see sometimes.
Well, so it's funny you mentioned that. Yo-Jed and I were actually co-authors on a paper together too. And so I know Yo-Jed very well. She is an expert in governance. From a strategy perspective, I also examine those questions from an accounting perspective. And so we're working together on a paper. But I'd also say if you look at corporate America, the reason why, and one of the reasons why the judge accepted this or sided with the shareholder is because the judge said the process by which he was awarded this was really unfair because a lot of the people on the board were friends of Elon's or his brother's on the board as well. And the judge said that wasn't properly disclosed to the shareholders. So even though the shareholders voted for this compensation package, they weren't really informed about these conflicting incentives by these board members. That's what the judge decided, right? And so, yeah. But, if you look at corporate America, if you look at Meta's board, Mark Zuckerberg has had relationships with lots of these people as well, right? And so corporate America, sometimes boards serve to oversee corporations and make sure that managers are making decisions aligned with shareholders' interests. But if you talk to boards, they often say, our job is to help run the company better. And so they look at their job as advising the CEO. And so, directors play this interesting role in which they're chosen on the board based on their expertise to help the organization operate better and more successfully. But the rules and the laws say they're also supposed to be there to oversee the company and make sure managers are acting in the shareholders' interests as well. And so it's an interesting tension that does play out in corporate America.
Yeah, it's a rich conversation. I will say, before talking to you, Judd, I had not thought at all about corporate governance. And then now I can't unthink about it. Every time you hear one of these stories and you hear about a board and what they're supposed to be doing and what they actually did, it's a super interesting topic. So I want to talk about some of your research as well as we kind of enter the final third of this conversation. And anything you're working on right now that you would want to share?
Yeah, excellent. So we're always working on stuff. And this is a great way to start a conversation with a faculty members to ask what their research is that they're working on, because it's often front and center of our mind. And so a lot of my research focuses on these governance issues, and in particular legal issues, accounting and law. And I'm really fascinated by that. I've also taught a course at the law school, and I've co-authored with several of my colleagues at the UVA Law School. And it's right next door. So we get together a lot. And one of the fascinations that I have is about corporate crime, white collar crime. And in an accounting context, we talk about fraud. So, you've heard of the Enrons and the WorldComs and the people who manipulate the numbers to achieve some sort of financial reporting goal. And so one thing that I'm looking at right now is the penalties that executives face when there are allegations of white collar crimes being committed in the organizations. And so I have a data set, and the data set is of individuals in the United States who have had allegations of misconduct brought against them. And so the way it works in America is that we have a bunch of regulatory bodies. In particular, the one that most commonly is associated with white collar crime is the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. The SEC investigates and prosecutes people for committing white collar crimes. And so I have a data set of individuals who the SEC has charged with white collar crimes. Okay. When that level of crime rises to a certain threshold to which the individual could be guilty of a criminal penalty, so maybe putting these people in jail, they forward the case to the United States attorney who is in the Department of Justice. And the United States attorney decides whether they're going to prosecute them for a crime or not. The SEC can only prosecute people and implement civil penalties, so they can fine people, for example. But the U.S. attorney can put people in jail. And so what I do is I have a whole sample of individuals in the United States who regulatory bodies like the SEC have forwarded to the United States Department of Justice for criminal prosecution for white collar crimes. And the question that I ask is, do executives fare differently than anyone else in the data set? Because one of the things that maybe you've heard of is, executives get off without any crimes. We have these global financial crisis, these people doing bad things, but nobody ever gets thrown in jail. So they have indemnity. We're not properly governing and punishing people, corporate executives, when they do wrong. And so I test this empirically. I say, is this true? Do corporate executives fare differently than everybody else? And what I find is it's very nuanced. Executives are less likely to be charged criminally than everybody else. But when they are charged, they're more likely to go to jail. The U.S. attorney throws the book at them. And so ultimately what I find is it's a very nuanced. You can't just say that executives get off scot-free. Okay. Because they typically are wealthier. They typically have relationships with external counsel. They understand these thorny legal issues. And so the United States attorney knows that if they're going to prosecute a corporate executive, they're going to have a fight on their hands. And they have limited resources, right? And so they got to choose carefully if they're going to go after a corporate executive, which is why they don't go after as many. But if they do go after them, they throw the book at them, and they're more likely to get punished and go to jail. And so it's a more nuanced interpretation of what actually happens when people are charged with crimes than you might hear in, say, popular media, popular press, right? It's not as sensational, but it's the fact of what actually happens in America.
What's interesting to you about insider trading? I think this is something that seems to pop up in the news with some frequency here, unfortunately.
Yeah, so insider trading is one setting that we look at. And the reason why is because it's mainly a data issue that we have every time an executive in corporate America trades in their own stock. So like, let's say Mark Zuckerberg were to sell shares of Meta. He's required to file what we call a Form 4 and to publicly post that on the SEC's website. So everybody can see, hey, Mark Zuckerberg just sold some shares of Meta. And we feel like that's useful information for the public to know if an executive is selling or buying shares of the company in which that they're operating under, right? They're serving as an executive as. It's also true for boards. And so as a result, professors like me, we have access to millions and millions of trades by corporate executives. And what we can do is we can look at how that corporation performed subsequent to that trade. So, for example, if Mark Zuckerberg sells shares and then 2 days later, Meta publicly announces, hey, we lost a bunch of money this quarter and the stock price falls, it kind of looks a little bit suspicious, doesn't it? An executive unloads a bunch of shares, then they issue bad news, and the price tanks. It looks like the one interpretation is that they sold their shares in advance of issuing these bad news. And so we can kind of publicly observe this without a prosecution happening. And so it's kind of interesting because typically we can't see corporate fraud happening unless it blows up and they're prosecuted for it. But in this case, we can see, hey, look, we can't prove that Mark Zuckerberg committed insider trading, but it looks like he traded immediately before those shares fell. Now, I want to be clear for everybody. This never happened. As far as I know, Mark Zuckerberg did not sell shares immediately before issuing bad news, but this is just an example, an illustration, right? And so we can run some statistical tests and say, hey, it's highly likely that insider trading happened, absent a prosecution. And so that's why insider trading becomes interesting from a research perspective, is it's purely a mechanism for us to be able to examine corporate crime in America without relying on prosecutions thereof.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Justin. We got a couple questions here. One question was about your financial reporting class. Do you just look at publicly traded companies, or do you ever look at any privately held companies in that financial reporting class?
Good question. Absolutely. So the problem with privately held companies is that I don't have access to their information. And so, we do try to. And sometimes we'll partner with private companies and they'll give us their information, but we have to hide their name. And so they, oftentimes they won't want to know. And this is for competitive reasons, because oftentimes if you know that this private company is making a ton of money doing this, then other people are going to go into their business. And so they're very careful about who's able to use their information and for what purposes. So typically we use public information just because it's accessible, but also because our students are typically going to be working with publicly traded companies. And so I want to show them, hey, look, here's the SEC's website. Here's how you get this information. Here's what information is available. And private firms, it's a whole different regulatory apparatus that governs them. And so just because our students are typically interacting with them more often too, it's more useful for them. But absolutely, in those cases where I can get information from private companies and they'll allow me to do it, I will absolutely use that information.
That's very interesting to hear about the sort of sensitivity about that and how they'd be reluctant to share. We also had a question about, you mentioned U.S. GAAP. Do you ever discuss in the accounting courses international standards? Is that something that comes up? The question was about sort of, obviously MBA is a very global environment. Do you explore international accounting standards too?
Yeah, very good question. So a lot of my students too, in fact, in my financial reporting class this year, I have a lot of students internationally, and they say one reason why they want to take the class is because they're very familiar with IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards, but they're not as comfortable with US GAAP. And so that's something that as an instructor, I'm very cognizant about. I've got a CPA from Nigeria. And so he's very familiar with the business context and the financial reporting in Nigeria. But he's come to Darden because he wants to learn about US GAAP. And so we'll have those opportunities in class where I'll rely on him. I'll say, hey, you might have seen this issue in Nigeria. How do they report for it there? Is this what you see there? And then that's when I'll open it up to students to be able to provide their own experiences and context. And they'll say, oh, yeah, this is how we do it there, right? And so this is one way that I can get students to interact and to bring that material into the classroom.
So, Justin, you talked about why you came to Darden as a faculty member and why the experience really resonated with you. I'm curious, if we have a number of prospective students across all of our MBA programs here today. What's your why Darden pitch for folks as they kind of think about their MBA journeys?
So you want me to recruit them? You want me to do your job then, Brett?
That's right. Yes, just for a few minutes here.
So I was thinking about this, and I was, I think what I would say is, I would say Darden isn't for everyone. I would say that what we do at Darden is we have a very unique offering among MBA programs, and I really don't think it's for everyone. What I would say is we have a very rigorous curriculum, and that doesn't mean you have to have a background at all, right? You don't have to have. Some of the most successful students are people who have non-traditional backgrounds, right? But you have to be willing to put the work in. You got to be willing to prepare in advance because your faculty members are going to expect that you come to class prepared. Okay, so long as you're willing to kind of commit to the model, this case method model, and we have a whole infrastructure around this. We have learning teams. We know what to do. We know how to set this up for success, but you have to be committed to it. You have to be willing to say, hey, look, I want to put the work in. I want to put the time in, and I really want to take this 2 years of my life to really grow professionally, right? There are schools where you can get an MBA and not put in that much effort and work, right? So maybe you don't want to commit to that. Maybe you're more interested in like the social aspects or being in a big city and being able to go out at night, right? That's perfectly fine. But at Darden, students are really committed to learning. They're committed to growing together. And because it's such I think, how do I want to put it? What we pride ourselves in is giving students a tremendous transformational learning experience. So we want you to be different when you leave. And in order to do that, you really have to be putting the time and the energy into it. And so if that's something that you really want to do, if that feels like that speaks to you, I think that this would be a good opportunity for you. I do. I think all the time about my students and how can I make this a transformational learning opportunity for them. And that's what we're committed to. But not everybody has that as a career goal, right? And so that would be my why. If you really want to look at the world differently, if you want to have an opportunity to be changed, I think this would be the place for you.
We always ask the same last question, Justin. We've talked about a lot of things here today. I appreciate all your insights about your own journey and accounting and what you're researching. But are there any books you would recommend or podcasts you recommend, any resources for folks who got interested in the topics we discussed here today, if they want to keep learning about these things?
Yeah. Excellent question. So, Brett, you gave me 3. You said I have 3 book recommendations. And so the 3 book recommendations that I have, and I sent you in advance. So one of them is by my ex-colleague, Brandon Garrett, who used to be at UVA Law, but now he's at Duke, good friend. He's got a book called Too Big to Jail. And so that talks about corporate prosecutions and the use now in what's called the deferred prosecution agreements. And so he kind of laments the idea that this particular prosecution tool is being used now. And so if you're interested in sort of like this idea of corporate crime and what happens when corporations are prosecuted, this is an excellent one. Okay. There's another one by an author named Sam Buell, who's also at Duke Law School. And so you're going to put that one in. So Sam has this book called Capital Offenses, and it talks about very similar topic, which is the reason why it's really challenging to hold corporations accountable is because there's diffused responsibility. So if somebody does something wrong and we find out within a corporation, who do we punish? Should we punish that person? Should we punish their boss who told them that that's what they should do? Should we punish that person's boss because they put forth an incentive structure that sort of facilitated these decisions to happen? So it becomes very tricky holding people accountable in corporations. And so he goes through some really interesting examples of how it's really a thorny legal issue when we have corporations who are found to have commit wrongdoing and how to hold people and those corporations accountable. So those are the 2 that for people who are interested in corporate crime or white collar crime and how they're prosecuted in America. And then the third one is just for fun. And this is a biography of U.S. Grant by Ron Chernow. I just love reading biographies of U.S. presidents. And I didn't know a lot about Grant as a president. And this book, of all biographies I've read, changed my mind the most. Grant was a fantastic leader, servant leader, not really a person who you'd say is, okay, this guy's a genius, right? He's very relatable. The first 30 years of his life cannot be classified as anything but abject failure. He just went bankrupt time and time again. And somehow, as circumstances would have it, he becomes elevated and becomes this fantastic leader for America and really helps us to get past the Civil War. So everything by Ron Chernow, but this one in particular.
Yeah, that is an amazing story. How obviously he becomes a very decorated general during the Civil War, and the rest, as they say, is history. Justin, thank you so much for your time today. It's such a pleasure chatting with you. I always learn something new on these sessions too. And to our prospective students, our attendees, thank you so much for your time. We'll be back in April 10, with Jared Harris, a member of the strategy faculty here. So hopefully we'll see you again soon. But thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Hold on.
And that was the latest installment from our Office Hours series featuring Professor Justin Hopkins. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at Darden, that's DARDEN, @virginia.edu. Till next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.